Since the fame?
Lonely, sad, having to face with popularity and all of that. There were times when I had great times with my brother, pillow fights and things, but I used to always cry from loneliness.
You did?
Yes.
Beginning at what age?
Oh, very little. 8, 9.
Michael Jackson's story, at its deepest level, isn't just about fame. It's about the space fame creates around a person, and what happens when that space becomes bigger than the person themselves. When no one can reach you without barriers, visible or invisible. When the world doesn't just watch you, it consumes you. When fame stops being a life and becomes a structure, something you live inside. A recent forensic look at Jackson's life calls this more than fame. It calls it a blueprint of isolation, as if the life he built, the places he chose to live, and the walls he constructed were not eccentric choices, but necessities created by the overwhelming pressure of his fame. And for the first time in history, someone had reached this level of recognition where there was no blueprint to follow, no map to help navigate it. He became the most famous man on earth without a guidebook. To understand this, you have to go back to the very beginning, before Thriller, before world domination, before the screaming crowds that would follow him across continents. Back when Michael was still Michael, before the isolation became total. Long before he was the king of pop, he was one of the Jackson 5. That period of their early fame in the late 60s and early 70s was sometimes compared to what people called J5 mania, a kind of proto-Beatlemania in America. There were crowds of thousands waiting outside venues, mobs at airports, fans trying to reach them wherever they went. In Memphis and Philadelphia, police had to escort the group to and from their hotel because fans would gather in overwhelming numbers. Newspapers from the era reported fans ripping shirts off the brothers, pushing on stage, and forcing shows to end early. Imagine being 8 or 9 years old and that is your normal. Imagine trying to go to a store and being seen as something other than the Jacksons. That was Michael's childhood. In an interview later in life, he talked about trying public school for 2 weeks and how it didn't work. He didn't have classmates, he had crowds. He never got the experience of ordinary childhood social life. The family moved often, forced to change addresses because fans didn't respect their privacy. They would wear oversized sunglasses, hats, anything they could to avoid recognition. But the fame kept finding them. And it didn't take long for young Michael to realize that the world didn't want him. It wanted his image, his act, his presence. And it was relentless. Even by the mid-1970s, as a teenager, that pressure was already shaping him in ways that wouldn't be immediately visible to the public. According to his mother, Katherine Jackson, Michael was upset by the constant crowding and lack of personal space. She wrote that when he had a crisis, he could be temperamental and withdrawn. The intrusion into his personal life was exhausting him even before he had reached adulthood. When he released Off the Wall in 1979, things began to feel even heavier. Off the Wall was not yet Thriller fame, but it was enough to push Michael into a space where normal life became harder to find. A newspaper report from that time notes him sitting in his room at the family home in Los Angeles, crying sometimes because he was so lonely. He would walk around his neighborhood at night looking for someone to talk to, but nobody was outside. And even when he tried, it didn't feel like connection. It was just another walk back to a life that had become surreal. That's the key detail most people miss. Even before global superstardom, Michael was already dealing with the emotional tension of isolation. Most of us think of loneliness as something that happens in private, but in his case, it began in broad daylight, in front of thousands of fans. Then came Thriller. Thriller changed everything. It was not just the album that sold tens of millions of copies. It was the moment Michael Jackson stopped being a musician and became a global force of nature. The kind of fame that didn't just bring cameras. It brought mobs of people who wanted physical contact, who wanted personal access, who wanted proximity. In a 1983 interview with Rolling Stone, Michael talked about how that level of fame changed how he even moved through the world. He recounted how Diana Ross once walked into a Manhattan shoe store with her daughters and was surrounded by 200 people on the sidewalk. He said he could not imagine dealing with that that even something as simple as going out to eat or shopping became a calculated operation involving aides and secretaries just to avoid being mobbed. "You don't get peace in a shop," he said. "If they don't know your name, they know your voice. And you can't hide." He described it not as admiration, but as a physical assault, as thousands of hands reaching for him, pulling, touching, ripping. He said it made him feel like spaghetti among thousands of hands. That powerful image of someone beloved and yet being physically overwhelmed tells you something about how fame hurt him as a human being, not just a celebrity. At this point in his life, even a hotel became a kind of prison. Fans would wait outside night and day. They'd camp out. They'd scream when he appeared at balconies or windows. In many cities, the crowds were so large they overwhelmed traffic, forcing roads to be blocked wherever he stayed. Cameras, spotlights, flashes turned every moment outside his own home into a spectacle. Michael tried disguises, hats, glasses, masks, anything to slip past the crowds. Most of the time, they didn't work. People recognized him by posture, by voice, by presence, and the paparazzi weren't far behind. They filmed him everywhere he went, even when he was trying to do something as ordinary as shopping or riding on an amusement park ride. Even then, he could not escape the cameras. All of this shaped how he thought about his own safety, his own privacy, and eventually his own sense of self. When you live your life as if the outside world is always there, always watching, always trying to touch you, always reconstructing you as something other than a person, it warps your sense of what is normal. And this is where the criticism around things like Neverland Ranch or his children wearing masks makes no sense until you unpack the context. Neverland was ridiculed as odd. Critics mocked the amusement park, the rides, the fantasy setting, but it wasn't designed for other people. It was designed for nobody else. It was a space where Michael could finally choose who was in the environment. Control replaced chaos. When you've never been able to walk through a street without being recognized, the idea of a private amusement park starts to feel less bizarre and more like a form of self-preservation. People who have never lived under that kind of constant attention cannot relate to what it's like to have your whole life governed by external eyes and expectations. Same with the masks for his children. Critics called it strange, even compared it in the press to something monstrous. None of those critics had to balance the desire to let children run free with the literal risk of mobs descending on them. Michael understood isolation more intimately because he had lived it his whole life. There are personal reflections that give even more depth to this. In various interviews and testimonies from people who knew him, Michael spoke about loneliness as a physical presence, an ache. One account describes him filling rooms with mannequins because he didn't have real people to talk to, and empty spaces made him feel worse. He said he would walk through crowds looking for someone to simply talk to, only to find people responding to his fame, not to him. Songs like Stranger in Moscow also tap into this feeling, a profound sense of isolation even in a crowd. The video depicts scenes of individuals living disconnected lives, including Jackson himself walking rain-soaked streets alone. It captures an internal landscape that few pop stars have ever exposed publicly, the emotional geography of loneliness. Even small victories, like finally walking through a supermarket without being mobbed, became emotional milestones for him. In 2003, he experienced this once, a moment he described as mundane, yet deeply meaningful, because it was something most people take for granted. In that small space, he tasted normalcy that fame otherwise denied him. This wasn't just celebrity loneliness. This was the loneliness of someone whose entire environment had been restructured by attention. Someone who lived inside a kind of protective shell, not because it was desired, but because it was the only place he could exist without physical invasion. Michael Jackson's life was dominated by the outside world's perception of him. The screaming crowds, the cameras, the microphones, the paparazzi. But inside that perception, there was a person longing for the simplest human connections. A person who just wanted someone to talk to without applause or screams. A person who tried walking at night hoping to find another human being just to share a moment, even if that human knew who he was. And that's the loneliest place Michael Jackson ever lived. Not inside a mansion, not behind bodyguards, not even inside a fantasy ranch. It was inside the invisible walls of his own fame, where people saw his image more than they ever saw the man himself. Fame didn't just surround him, it enclosed him. And that's why his life always felt like a search, not for recognition, not for applause, but for something no fame could ever give: connection.